She heard her fiancé's confession minutes before the wedding, and her revenge surprised everyone. Have you ever wondered what you would do if you discovered the person you were about to marry was living a complete lie? Today, I'm going to share with you one of the most shocking wedding stories you'll ever hear. A tale of betrayal, quick thinking, and revenge that no one saw coming. This is the incredible true story of Sarah Mitchell, a woman who turned what should have been the worst day of her life into a moment of triumph that would change everything. If you're ready for a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat and restore your faith in justice, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss these amazing stories. Now let's dive into this extraordinary tale that proves sometimes the best revenge is the truth. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Cathedral in downtown Chicago, casting rainbow patterns across the polished marble floors as Sarah Mitchell stood in the bride's preparation room, staring at herself in the full-length mirror. Her wedding dress, a stunning creation of ivory silk and delicate French lace that had taken her mother 6 months to save for, hung perfectly on her slender frame. The dress had been her grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of women who had worn it on what they believed were the happiest days of their lives. Sarah's reflection showed a beautiful 28-year-old woman with auburn hair styled in an elegant updo, secured with her great-grandmother's pearl hairpins. Her makeup was flawless, applied by her best friend and maid of honor, Jessica, who had insisted on hiring a professional makeup artist despite Sarah's protests about the expense. The deep green eyes that stared back at her from the mirror held a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and something else she couldn't quite identify, a tiny nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach that she had been trying to ignore for weeks. Today was supposed to be the culmination of 2 years of planning, dreaming, and preparing for what she believed would be the beginning of her perfect life with Marcus Thompson, the man she had fallen in love with during her final year at Northwestern University. Marcus was everything she had ever dreamed of in a partner: tall, handsome, with piercing blue eyes and a smile that could light up any room. He was successful, working as a senior marketing executive at one of Chicago's most prestigious advertising firms, drove a sleek BMW, and lived in a beautiful downtown loft that overlooked Lake Michigan. More importantly, Marcus seemed to share all of her values and dreams for the future. They had spent countless hours talking about their plans to travel the world together, to start a family within a few years, to build a life based on honesty, trust, and unconditional love. He had proposed to her on a romantic weekend getaway to Napa Valley, getting down on one knee in a vineyard at sunset, with a ring that had taken him months to save for, or so he had told her. Sarah worked as a third-grade teacher at Lincoln Elementary School on Chicago's South Side, a job that she loved despite the challenges of working in an underfunded school district. Her salary was modest, but she found deep satisfaction in helping shape young minds and making a difference in her students' lives. Marcus had always been supportive of her career choice, even though his income was significantly higher than hers. He often told her how much he admired her dedication to her students and her desire to make the world a better place. Their relationship had moved relatively quickly by modern standards. They had met at a charity fundraiser that Jessica had dragged Sarah to, claiming she needed to get out more and meet someone who could appreciate her kind heart and sharp wit. Marcus had approached her at the silent auction, where she was bidding on a weekend getaway to Door County, Wisconsin. He had made a joke about outbidding her, but then surprised her by encouraging her to increase her bid and even contributing to help her win the package. That night, they had talked for hours about everything from their favorite books to their childhood dreams, their fears about the future, and their hopes for making a meaningful impact on the world. Marcus had told her about his difficult childhood, growing up with an alcoholic father and a mother who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. He had paid his own way through college, working nights and weekends while maintaining excellent grades, and had built his career through sheer determination and hard work. Sarah had been impressed by his resilience and touched by his vulnerability in sharing such personal details with someone he had just met. She came from a loving, stable family. Her father was a high school principal and her mother was a nurse, and she felt drawn to Marcus's strength in overcoming his challenging background. When he asked her out for coffee the next day, she didn't hesitate to say yes. Their courtship had been like something out of a romantic movie. Marcus was attentive, thoughtful, and generous with both his time and his affection. He sent her flowers at school just because it was Tuesday, surprised her with tickets to shows she had mentioned wanting to see, and always seemed to remember the little things that mattered to her. He brought her soup when she was sick, listened patiently when she had difficult days at work, and made her laugh when she was stressed about her students or worried about her aging grandmother. When Marcus proposed after 18 months of dating, Sarah felt like the luckiest woman in the world. The proposal had been perfect, romantic but not overly elaborate, personal and meaningful rather than flashy. They had planned a wedding that reflected both of their personalities, elegant but not extravagant, focused on celebrating their love with the people who mattered most to them, rather than impressing anyone with expensive details. Now, as Sarah stood in the bridal preparation room with just 30 minutes until the ceremony was scheduled to begin, she was trying to calm the butterflies in her stomach and focus on the joy of the moment. Her mother, Patricia, bustled around the room making final adjustments to Sarah's dress and veil, while Jessica touched up Sarah's lipstick and made sure every hair was in place. "You look absolutely radiant, sweetheart," Patricia said, stepping back to admire her daughter. "I've never seen you look more beautiful." "Mum's right," Jessica agreed, dabbing at her own eyes to avoid smudging her makeup. "Marcus is going to fall over when he sees you walking down that aisle." Sarah smiled at her reflection, but that nagging feeling in her stomach seemed to be getting stronger rather than weaker as the minutes ticked by. She had been having strange dreams for the past week, dreams where Marcus was someone else entirely, where their wedding turned into a nightmare, where she discovered terrible secrets that changed everything she thought she knew about the man she loved. "It's just pre-wedding jitters," she told herself firmly. "Every bride feels this way." But even as she tried to rationalize her feelings, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of the strange phone call Marcus had received 3 nights ago during dinner at their favorite restaurant. He had excused himself to take the call outside, claiming it was work-related, but when he returned 20 minutes later, he had been pale and distracted for the rest of the evening. When she asked if everything was okay, he had brushed off her concerns and changed the subject. There had been other small incidents over the past few weeks, mysterious text messages that made him frown and quickly delete, a credit card statement that arrived at her apartment by mistake showing charges she didn't recognize, and a conversation she had overheard between Marcus and his best man, Derek, that stopped abruptly when they noticed her approaching. "Sarah, honey, you need to drink some water," her mother said, noticing that her daughter looked pale despite her expertly applied makeup. "You look like you're about to faint." "I'm fine, Mom," Sarah replied, though she gratefully accepted the bottle of water Patricia offered. "Just nervous, I guess." "That's completely normal," Jessica assured her, checking her watch. "But we should probably start heading down soon. The photographer wants to get some final shots of you before the processional begins." Sarah nodded and took one last look at herself in the mirror. Whatever was causing her anxiety, she was determined not to let it ruin what was supposed to be the most important day of her life. Marcus loved her, she loved him, and they were about to commit to spending the rest of their lives together. Everything else was just pre-wedding nerves that would disappear the moment she saw him waiting for her at the altar. "Okay," she said, picking up her bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. "I'm ready." As they prepared to leave the bridal preparation room, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. She almost ignored it, but something made her glance at the screen. The message was from an unknown number, and all it said was, "Check the groom's room now. You deserve to know the truth." Sarah's blood ran cold as she stared at the message. Her hands began to tremble, and the bouquet nearly slipped from her grasp. "What is it, sweetheart?" Patricia asked, noticing her daughter's sudden change in demeanor. I need to use the restroom one more time," Sarah managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just give me a minute." Before either her mother or Jessica could respond, Sarah was out the door and walking quickly down the hallway toward the men's preparation area. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, and her mouth felt dry despite the water she had just drunk. The corridor leading to the groom's room was empty, except for a hotel employee adjusting flowers in a nearby alcove. Sarah's heels clicked on the marble floor as she approached the heavy wooden door marked Groom's Suite. She could hear voices inside, Marcus's voice and Derek's, along with what sounded like at least 2 other men. Sarah pressed her ear to the door, telling herself she was being ridiculous, that whatever she might hear would be harmless conversation between nervous men preparing for a wedding. But what she heard instead made her blood freeze and her entire world come crashing down around her. Look, man, you've got to calm down, Derek was saying. You're getting married in 20 minutes. Sarah's going to be walking down that aisle expecting to marry the man she thinks she knows. I know, Marcus replied, and his voice sounded strained and panicked. But what if she finds out? What if someone tells her the truth about who I really am? Who's going to tell her? Another voice chimed in. Sarah recognized it as Marcus's cousin, Tom. Everyone who knows the truth has too much to lose by talking. But what about Amanda? Marcus asked, and Sarah had to grip the door frame to keep from falling. What if she decides to show up? What if she changes her mind about keeping quiet? Amanda's not going to say anything, Derek said firmly. She's got her settlement money. She's moved to another state, and she has no reason to ruin her own life by exposing what happened. Sarah felt like she was going to be sick. Who was Amanda? What settlement money? What had happened that was so terrible that someone had to be paid to keep quiet about it? I never meant for it to go this far, Marcus continued, his voice now clearly audible through the door. When I first met Sarah, I thought it would just be a casual thing, maybe a few months of dating. I never expected to fall for her, and I definitely never expected her to want to get married. But you do love her, right? Tom asked. I mean, this isn't just about needing a cover story anymore? Of course I love her, Marcus snapped. That's what makes this so complicated. Sarah is everything I never knew I wanted. She's kind, honest, pure. She believes in me, believes in the person she thinks I am. But if she knew the truth about my past, about what I've done, about who I really am, she would run as far and as fast as she could. Then don't tell her, Derek said simply. What happened with Amanda was years ago. You've changed. You're a different person now. Sarah doesn't need to know about your past mistakes. Mistakes? Marcus laughed bitterly. You call fraud, embezzlement, and ruining multiple people's lives mistakes? Derek, I went to prison. I served 2 years for financial crimes. I stole money from my previous company. I destroyed evidence. I lied under oath. The only reason I'm not still in prison is because I cut a deal with the prosecutors and testified against my partners. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as she processed what she was hearing. The man she was about to marry, the man she had trusted with her heart and her future, was a convicted criminal who had been lying to her about his entire past. And then there's the other thing, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The thing with Amanda. We agreed never to talk about that, Derek said sharply. I know, but it's eating me alive, Marcus replied. Sarah deserves better than this. She deserves better than me. You can't back out now, Tom said urgently. Think about what you've built here. Your job, your reputation, your life. It's all based on the identity you've created. If you tell Sarah the truth now, everything falls apart. She'll leave you, your employer will find out about your record, and you'll lose everything. Maybe I should lose everything, Marcus said quietly. Maybe that's what I deserve. Listen to me, Derek said, his voice taking on a commanding tone. You served your time, you paid your debt to society, and you've been clean for 4 years. You're not the same person who made those mistakes. Sarah loves you for who you are now, and that person is real even if your past is complicated. But I'm still lying to her every single day, Marcus protested. Every time she talks about how honest and trustworthy I am, every time she tells people how lucky she is to have found someone with such strong moral character, I feel like I'm going to be sick. Then be the person she believes you are, Derek replied. You can't change the past, but you can control your future. Marry Sarah, be a good husband to her, and leave the past where it belongs. Sarah backed away from the door slowly, her mind reeling with what she had just heard. Everything she thought she knew about Marcus was a lie. His job, his background, his past, all of it was fabricated. The man she was about to marry was a convicted criminal who had been living under a false identity for years. But even worse than the lies about his past was the casual way he and his friends were discussing deceiving her. They weren't planning to tell her the truth after the wedding. They weren't planning to tell her ever. They expected her to live her entire life, married to a man who was fundamentally different from who he claimed to be. Sarah's first instinct was to burst through the door and confront Marcus directly, but something stopped her. Maybe it was her teacher's training in staying calm during crises, or maybe it was some deeper instinct for self-preservation. But instead of acting on her anger and hurt, Sarah found herself thinking strategically. If she confronted Marcus now, he would deny everything, or try to explain it away. Derek and Tom would back up his story, and she would be left to wonder what was true and what wasn't. Even if she called off the wedding, Marcus would still have his job, his life, and his reputation intact, while she would be left dealing with the embarrassment and financial consequences of cancelling a wedding at the last minute. But there was another option, one that would ensure the truth came out and that Marcus faced consequences for his deception. Sarah thought about the 200 guests who were currently taking their seats in the cathedral, many of whom were Marcus's colleagues, clients, and professional contacts. She thought about the minister, who was prepared to ask if anyone knew of any reason why these two people should not be wed. She thought about the photographer and videographer, who were documenting every moment of what was supposed to be their special day. A plan began to form in Sarah's mind, a plan that was both elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. Marcus wanted to maintain his false identity and his carefully constructed life. He wanted to deceive her and everyone else indefinitely. She was going to give him the opportunity to do exactly that in front of everyone who mattered to him. Sarah pulled out her phone and quickly typed a text message to Jessica. "Tell everyone I need 5 more minutes, having a bride moment. Start without me if needed." Then she hurried back toward the bridal preparation room, her mind racing as she refined her plan. When she opened the door, she found her mother and Jessica pacing anxiously. "There you are," Jessica exclaimed. "We were starting to worry. The photographer is asking for you, and the wedding coordinator says we need to start the processional in 10 minutes. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "I just needed a moment to collect myself. You know how it is." "Of course, honey," Patricia said, though she was studying her daughter's face with the perceptive eye of a mother who had raised 3 children. "Are you sure you're okay? You look a little pale." "I'm fine, Mom," Sarah replied, moving to her purse and pulling out her phone again. "I just need to send one quick text and then I'm ready." As her mother and Jessica made final adjustments to her dress and veil, Sarah composed a message that would change everything. She created a group text that included her father, her brothers, her closest friends from college, and several people from her school who she knew would be discreet but supportive. The message read, "Something has come up that I need to address during the ceremony today. Please stay calm no matter what happens, and please trust that I know what I'm doing. I love you all." She hit send just as the wedding coordinator knocked on the door. "Ladies, it's time," the coordinator announced. "The processional needs to begin in 3 minutes." Sarah took a deep breath and looked at herself one final time in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was the same person who had been getting ready for her dream wedding just 20 minutes ago. But everything had changed. She was no longer a naive bride about to marry the man of her dreams. She was a woman who had discovered a devastating truth and was about to handle it in a way that no one would expect. "I'm ready," she said, and for the first time all day, she truly was. The processional began exactly as they had rehearsed the night before. Sarah's grandmother walked slowly down the aisle, followed by Marcus's mother, who had flown in from Denver for the wedding. Then came the bridesmaids, Jessica's sister Emily, Sarah's college roommate Lisa, and Marcus's sister Jennifer, who had become one of Sarah's closest friends over the past 2 years. Jessica, as maid of honor, walked down the aisle just before Sarah, carrying a smaller bouquet and wearing a dress in the soft blue color Sarah had chosen to complement the white roses and greenery throughout the cathedral. As Jessica took her place at the altar, she caught Sarah's eye and gave her an encouraging smile, unaware that her best friend was about to do something that would shock everyone in attendance. The bridal march began, and Sarah appeared at the back of the cathedral on her father's arm. Despite everything she had just learned, she looked radiant as she began her slow walk down the aisle. The guests rose to their feet, many of them dabbing at their eyes as they watched the beautiful bride make her way toward the altar. Marcus stood at the front of the cathedral in his perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his blue eyes bright with what appeared to be love and anticipation. Derek stood beside him as best man, along with Tom and Marcus's brother-in-law as groomsmen. To any observer, Marcus looked like a man who was about to marry the love of his life. But Sarah could see things that others couldn't. She noticed the slight tremor in Marcus's hands, the way he kept glancing at Derek as if seeking reassurance, the forced quality of his smile. Now that she knew what to look for, she could see the signs of his deception and anxiety that she had missed before. As Sarah reached the altar, and her father lifted her veil to kiss her cheek before placing her hand in Marcus's, she felt a moment of sadness for the man she had thought she was marrying. The Marcus she had fallen in love with, The kind, honest, hard-working man who shared her values and dreams, that man didn't exist. In his place was someone who had been lying to her every day for 2 years. "You look beautiful," Marcus whispered as they turned to face the minister, and for a moment Sarah almost believed that his love for her was real, despite everything else being a lie. Reverend Wilson, who had known Sarah's family for years and had counseled her and Marcus through their pre-marriage sessions, smiled warmly at the couple as he began the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join Marcus Thompson and Sarah Mitchell in holy matrimony," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's excellent acoustics. Sarah stood perfectly still, her bouquet steady in her hands, as the Reverend continued with the traditional opening words of the ceremony. She was acutely aware of every person in the cathedral, of the photographer moving quietly to capture different angles, of the videographer recording every word for posterity. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but thoughtfully and seriously, with a deep realization of its obligations and responsibilities. Reverend Wilson continued, "The essence of this commitment is the taking of another person in his or her entirety, as lover, companion, and friend." The irony of those words was not lost on Sarah. How could she take Marcus in his entirety when she didn't even know who he really was? "It is a beautiful tribute to your relationship that you have chosen to be married here today, surrounded by the people who love and support you," the Reverend said. "But before we proceed, I must ask if there is anyone here who knows of any lawful reason why Marcus and Sarah should not be joined in marriage. If so, speak now, or forever hold your peace." This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. Traditionally, this part of the ceremony was a formality, a holdover from ancient times when someone might object to a marriage for legal reasons. In modern weddings, it was rare for anyone to actually speak up during this pause. The cathedral fell silent as Reverend Wilson waited the customary few seconds before moving on to the vows. Sarah could feel Marcus's hand tightening around hers, and she wondered if he was thinking about his conversation with Derek and Tom, if he was worried that someone might actually know something about his past. Just as the Reverend was about to continue, Sarah took a step forward. "I do," she said clearly, her voice carrying throughout the silent cathedral. The collective gasp from the guests was audible. Marcus turned to stare at her in shock, his face going pale beneath his tan. Derek and Tom exchanged panicked glances, while Jessica and Sarah's mother looked confused and alarmed. "I'm sorry, my dear," Reverend Wilson said, clearly taken aback. In his 30 years of performing wedding ceremonies, he had never had a bride object to her own wedding. Sarah turned to face the congregation, still holding her bouquet, her voice steady and clear. "I said I do. I know of a reason why Marcus Thompson and I should not be married." The cathedral erupted in whispers and murmurs as guests turned to look at each other in confusion. Marcus reached for Sarah's arm, but she stepped away from him. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Marcus hissed, his voice barely audible, but his panic clearly visible to anyone looking at him. Sarah ignored him and continued, addressing the congregation. 20 minutes ago, I discovered that the man I was about to marry has been living a lie for the entire duration of our relationship. Sarah, please, Marcus said louder now, desperation creeping into his voice. You don't understand, let me explain. But Sarah wasn't finished. She had the attention of everyone in the cathedral, including Marcus's colleagues, clients, and business associates, who had come to celebrate what they thought was his wedding to a wonderful woman. The man standing beside me told me his name was Marcus Thompson, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. He told me he grew up in a middle-class family in Ohio, that he worked his way through college, that he built his career through hard work and determination. He told me he had never been married before, that he had no criminal record, and that honesty and integrity were the most important values in his life. The murmurs in the cathedral were growing louder, and several people had pulled out their phones to record what was happening. Marcus's face had gone from pale to grey, and Derek was trying to signal to him to do something to stop Sarah from talking. But what I discovered today, Sarah said, her voice now carrying to every corner of the cathedral, is that Marcus Thompson is not his real name. The man I thought I knew and loved is actually someone who spent 2 years in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement. He stole money from his previous employer, destroyed evidence to cover his tracks, and then disappeared into a new identity when he was released from prison. The cathedral exploded in shocked exclamations and gasps. Marcus's boss, Richard Henley, who was sitting in the third row, stood up abruptly, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. Several of Marcus's colleagues were whispering urgently to each other, and Sarah could see some of them already reaching for their phones to make calls. Furthermore, Sarah continued, raising her voice to be heard over the commotion, I learned that there was a woman named Amanda who was somehow involved in his past, and that she was paid settlement money to keep quiet about something that happened between them. Marcus finally found his voice. Sarah, stop, he shouted, grabbing her arm roughly. You don't know what you're talking about. You're ruining everything. I'm ruining everything, Sarah replied, finally turning to look directly at him. Marcus, you've been lying to me every single day for 2 years. You let me plan a future with someone who doesn't even exist. You were going to let me marry you without ever knowing who you really are. I can explain everything, Marcus said desperately. Yes, I made mistakes in the past, but I've changed. I'm not that person anymore. The man you fell in love with is real, even if some of the details about my past were simplified. Simplified? Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. You mean fabricated? You mean you created an entirely false identity and have been living a lie for years? Derek finally stepped forward, trying to take control of the situation. Sarah, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Why don't we all step into the vestry and discuss this privately? No, Sarah said firmly. I think we've had enough private discussions and secret conversations. I think it's time for the truth to come out in front of everyone who matters. She turned back to the congregation, many of whom were now standing and talking loudly among themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for being here today to witness what was supposed to be the beginning of my marriage. Instead, you've witnessed the end of a relationship built on lies and deception. Richard Henley had pushed his way to the front of the cathedral and was staring at Marcus with barely controlled fury. Is this true? He demanded. Are you telling me that everything on your employment application was false? That you've been working for my company under a false identity? Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The elaborate web of lies he had constructed was unraveling in front of everyone who mattered to his carefully built new life. I think that's answer enough, Richard said coldly. Security will be at your office first thing Monday morning to escort you out and retrieve your access cards and company property. Mr. Henley, please, Marcus began, but Richard had already turned away and was walking toward the exit. Sarah watched as more of Marcus's professional contacts followed Richard's lead, leaving the cathedral while talking urgently on their phones. She felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness as she realized that Marcus's deception was finally catching up with him in a very public and devastating way. Jessica finally broke through her shock and made her way to Sarah's side. Honey, what happened? How did you find out about all this? Sarah quickly explained about the anonymous text message and what she had overheard outside the groom's room. As she spoke, she could see the anger and protectiveness building in Jessica's eyes. I can't believe he was going to go through with the wedding knowing all this, Jessica said, glaring at Marcus. How could you do this to her? How could you lie about something so fundamental? Marcus seemed to have aged 10 years in the past 20 minutes. His carefully styled hair was disheveled from running his hands through it. His face was ashen, and his confident demeanor had completely crumbled. I never meant for it to go this far, he said quietly, not looking at anyone in particular. When I first created this identity, I thought it would just be temporary, just until I could get back on my feet. But then I met Sarah, and she was so incredible, so pure and good. I thought maybe I could deserve someone like her if I just tried hard enough to be the person she believed I was. But you weren't being that person, Sarah replied. You were just pretending to be that person while lying to me about everything that mattered. Patricia, who had been standing in stunned silence near the altar, finally found her voice. Sarah, sweetheart, I think we should go. There's nothing more to be accomplished here. Sarah nodded, realizing that her mother was right. She had exposed Marcus's deception and ensured that he would face consequences for his lies, but there was no point in prolonging the scene. You're right, Mom, she said, then turned to address the remaining guests. I want to apologize to everyone for the disruption, and I want to thank you for your understanding. The reception is cancelled, obviously, but I hope you'll understand that I couldn't go through with marrying someone under these circumstances. As Sarah began to walk back down the aisle, Marcus called after her one last time. Sarah, please. I know I've made terrible mistakes, But I do love you. That was never a lie. Can't we talk about this privately? Can't we try to work through this? Sarah stopped and turned back to look at him one final time. Marcus, I don't even know who you are. The man I fell in love with doesn't exist. Even if you do love me, you loved me enough to lie to me every single day for 2 years. You loved me enough to let me plan a future based on fiction. That's not the kind of love I want to build a life on. With that, Sarah walked out of the cathedral, her head held high despite the tears that were finally beginning to fall. Jessica and her family surrounded her protectively as they made their way to the cars, while behind them, the guests continued to buzz with shock and speculation about what they had just witnessed. The aftermath of Sarah's dramatic wedding revelation spread quickly through Chicago's business and social circles. By Monday morning, the story was being discussed in offices, coffee shops, and social media groups throughout the city. Marcus's employer, after conducting a weekend investigation into his background, not only fired him, but also reported him to the authorities for identity fraud and falsifying employment documents. The police investigation that followed revealed that Marcus's real name was Michael Torres, and that his criminal background was even more extensive than what Sarah had overheard. In addition to the fraud and embezzlement charges, he had also been involved in a hit-and-run accident that had seriously injured a young mother, and Amanda was the victim, who had been paid a settlement to avoid pressing additional charges. Within a week, Michael Torres was back in custody, facing new charges for identity fraud, employment fraud, and violation of his parole terms. The carefully constructed life he had built as Marcus Thompson was completely destroyed, and he would likely spend several more years in prison. For Sarah, the days and weeks following the failed wedding were a mixture of grief, relief, and gradual healing. The financial cost of the cancelled wedding was significant, but her family and friends rallied around her to help with both the emotional and practical consequences of the situation. Jessica, who had always been protective of her best friend, was particularly angry about how close Sarah had come to marrying someone who was essentially a stranger. "I can't believe how good he was at lying," she said during one of their many post-wedding conversations. "He had me completely fooled too. I actually liked him and thought he was perfect for you." "That's what makes it so scary," Sarah replied. "He wasn't just telling little lies or hiding embarrassing details about his past. He had created an entirely false identity and was living it so completely that even people who saw him every day had no idea who he really was." Sarah's parents, while devastated by what their daughter had gone through, were proud of how she had handled the situation. "I don't know how you had the presence of mind to think so clearly in that moment," her father told her. "Most people would have either confronted him privately or just called off the wedding quietly. But you made sure that the truth came out and that he faced real consequences for what he did." "I kept thinking about all the other people he was deceiving," Sarah explained. "His employer, his colleagues, his friends, they all deserved to know who they were really dealing with, and I thought about what would have happened if I had just called off the wedding quietly. He would have just moved on to the next unsuspecting woman and done the same thing all over again." The story of Sarah's wedding day revenge became something of a legend in Chicago, shared and retold in various versions throughout the city's social networks. Some people criticized her for handling it so publicly, arguing that she should have dealt with the situation privately. But many more people praised her for her courage and quick thinking in a devastating situation. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a psychologist who specialized in relationships and trust issues, weighed in on the story during a local television interview. "What Sarah did was actually very psychologically healthy," she explained. "She discovered that her reality was completely false, and rather than going into denial or trying to rationalize the situation, she immediately took action to reclaim her truth and her power. The public nature of her revelation ensured that the person who had deceived her faced real consequences, which is often missing in these types of situations." 3 months after the failed wedding, Sarah received a letter from Amanda, the woman who had been mentioned during Marcus's conversation with his friends. Amanda had seen the news coverage of the wedding incident and wanted to thank Sarah for having the courage to expose Marcus's true nature. In her letter, Amanda explained that Marcus, or Michael Torres as she knew him, had been her boyfriend several years earlier when he was first released from prison. He had convinced her that he was reformed and committed to building an honest life, but he had actually been using her as cover while he stole money from the non-profit organization where she worked. When Amanda discovered what he was doing and threatened to report him, Michael had become violent, eventually pushing her down a flight of stairs during an argument. The settlement money that Derek had mentioned was actually hush money that Michael had paid her to avoid assault charges that would have sent him back to prison. "I've regretted staying quiet about what he did ever since," Amanda wrote. "I knew he was probably doing the same thing to other women, but I was scared of him and didn't want to get involved. When I saw what you did at your wedding, I was inspired by your bravery. You did what I should have done years ago." Amanda's letter confirmed for Sarah that her instinct to expose Marcus publicly had been the right choice. If she had handled the situation privately, Marcus would have likely disappeared and started over somewhere else with yet another false identity, leaving more victims in his wake. As the months passed, Sarah began to rebuild her life and her faith in relationships. The experience had been traumatic, but it had also shown her that she was stronger and more resilient than she had realized. She threw herself into her work at the school, finding comfort and purpose in helping her students learn and grow. She also began volunteering with a local organization that helped victims of fraud and identity theft, using her experience to help others who had been deceived by people they trusted. The work was emotionally difficult but rewarding, and it helped her process her own experience while making a positive difference in other people's lives. Jessica worried that the experience might make Sarah too cautious or mistrustful to ever have another serious relationship, but Sarah was determined not to let Marcus's deception poison her view of love entirely. "What happened to me was terrible," she told Jessica during one of their regular coffee dates, "but it doesn't mean that all men are liars or that love isn't real. It just means that I need to be more careful and more aware of red flags that I might have ignored before." "What kind of red flags?" Jessica asked, curious about what her friend had learned from the experience. "Well, for one thing, I realized that I never really knew Marcus's friends or family very well," Sarah explained. "He always had excuses for why I couldn't meet people from his past, or why certain friends couldn't come to events. I thought he was just private, but really he was keeping me away from anyone who might know the truth about him." "What else?" "He was also very controlling about information," Sarah continued. "He always insisted on handling things like insurance, bank accounts, credit reports, anything that might reveal information about his real identity. At the time, I thought he was just being helpful and taking care of the details, but really he was making sure I never saw anything that would expose his lies." Sarah also realized that Marcus had been very good at deflecting personal questions by turning the conversation back to her, or by sharing emotional but vague stories about his past that generated sympathy without providing concrete details that could be verified. "The scariest part," Sarah said, "is how good he was at being the person he thought I wanted him to be. He listened to what I said about my values and dreams, and then he reflected them back to me perfectly. It wasn't that he was pretending to share my interests. He was actually mirroring my entire personality and value system." A year after the failed wedding, Sarah was contacted by a journalist who was writing a book about fraud and deception in modern relationships. The journalist, Rebecca Martinez, had heard about Sarah's story and wanted to include it as a case study in her book. "Your story is particularly interesting," Rebecca explained during their first interview, "because it shows how identity fraud has evolved in the digital age. Your fiancé wasn't just lying about his past. He had literally created a new legal identity, complete with social security number, employment history, credit report, and references. This level of sophisticated deception is becoming more common, and it's very difficult for victims to detect." Sarah agreed to participate in the book project, hoping that sharing her story might help other people recognize similar warning signs in their own relationships. She also wanted to highlight the importance of trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you can't put your finger on what it is. "I had that nagging feeling in my stomach for weeks before the wedding," Sarah told Rebecca. "I kept telling myself it was just normal pre-wedding nerves, but deep down I think some part of me knew that something wasn't right. I wish I had listened to that feeling sooner." The book, titled The Stranger I Married: How to Protect Yourself from Romance Fraud, was published 2 years later and became a bestseller. Sarah's story was featured prominently, and she began receiving emails and messages from women all over the country who had experienced similar situations. Many of these women told Sarah that reading her story had given them the courage to investigate suspicious behavior in their own relationships, and several had discovered that their partners were living double lives. Others said that Sarah's example had inspired them to trust their instincts and ask harder questions when something felt wrong. "I never expected my worst day to end up helping so many other people," Sarah told Jessica. "But I guess if something positive can come out of what I went through, then maybe it was worth it." 5 years after the wedding that never was, Sarah was living a completely different life than the one she had planned with Marcus. She had been promoted to assistant principal at her school, had completed a master's degree in educational administration, and had become a sought-after speaker on topics related to trust, intuition, and personal safety. She had also found love again, this time with David Chen, a fellow educator who taught high school mathematics. David was everything that Marcus had only pretended to be, genuinely kind, honest to a fault, and committed to making the world a better place through his work with students. Their relationship had developed slowly and carefully, with Sarah taking the time to really get to know David's friends, family, and background before allowing herself to fall in love. David was patient with her caution and admired her strength in overcoming such a devastating betrayal. When David proposed to Sarah 3 years after they met, he did so at the school where they both worked, surrounded by colleagues and students who had watched their relationship grow. It was simple, honest, and completely different from Marcus's elaborate proposal in Napa Valley. "I know you've been hurt before," David said as he got down on one knee in the school's courtyard, "but I want you to know that with me, what you see is what you get. I'm a math teacher from suburban Chicago who loves you more than I ever thought possible, and I promise to be honest with you about everything, even the boring stuff." Sarah said yes immediately, not because David was perfect, but because he was real. Their engagement was followed by a small, intimate wedding ceremony in Sarah's parents' backyard, with only family and close friends in attendance. There were no surprises, no secrets, and no last-minute revelations. Just two people who loved each other, committing to building an honest life together. As Sarah and David exchanged vows in the garden where she had played as a child, surrounded by people who had supported her through the worst period of her life, she reflected on how much she had learned and grown since that devastating day at St. Michael's Cathedral. She had learned that trust was not something to be given blindly, but something to be earned through consistent actions over time. She had learned that her instincts were more reliable than she had given them credit for, and that it was better to ask difficult questions than to ignore uncomfortable feelings. Most importantly, she had learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, capable of handling devastating betrayal with grace and turning the worst experience of her life into something that helped both herself and others. Marcus Thompson, or Michael Torres, was still in prison, serving a sentence that would keep him there for several more years. According to the updates Sarah occasionally received through the Victim Services Program, he had never stopped claiming that his feelings for her had been genuine, even if everything else about his identity had been false. Sarah had no interest in visiting him or responding to the letters he occasionally sent through his lawyer. Whatever genuine feelings he might have had for her had been overshadowed by his willingness to build their entire relationship on a foundation of lies and deception. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just gone through with the wedding?" Jessica asked during Sarah and David's wedding reception. "If you had never found out the truth?" Sarah considered the question as she watched David talking with her father about baseball statistics, his genuine enthusiasm for both the conversation and the sport evident in every gesture. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted, "and I think eventually the truth would have come out anyway. People like Marcus, people like Michael, they can't keep up a false identity forever. Something always happens that exposes them. I'm just grateful that I found out before I legally tied my life to his." "Do you think he really loved you?" Sarah thought about that question for a long moment. "I think he loved the idea of me," she said finally. "He loved having someone who believed in him and saw the best in him. But real love requires honesty and vulnerability, and he was never honest with me about anything that mattered. So no, I don't think what he felt was real love. It was something else. Obsession, maybe, or just a desire to possess something good and pure that he felt he didn't deserve." As the evening wound down and Sarah and David prepared to leave for their honeymoon, a simple road trip through the national parks of Utah and Colorado, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace and gratitude. The road that had led her to this moment had been painful and difficult, but it had also taught her invaluable lessons about herself and about what she really wanted in a partner and in life. The anonymous text message that had shattered her world 5 years earlier had turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to her, even though it hadn't felt that way at the time. Whoever had sent that message, and Sarah never did find out who it was, had saved her from a lifetime of living a lie. Looking back, Sarah realized that her story was not really about revenge, despite how it had been framed in the media coverage and in Rebecca's book. It was about truth, and about the courage to face devastating facts and act on them, even when doing so required giving up everything you thought you wanted. Standing in her parents' garden, surrounded by the people who loved her for exactly who she was, married to a man who knew all her flaws and chose to love her anyway, Sarah Mitchell Chen finally had the life she had always dreamed of, a life built on honesty, trust, and authentic love, and that she knew was the best revenge of all. I hope Sarah's incredible story of courage, truth, and ultimately triumph has moved you as much as it has moved me. Her journey reminds us that sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest growth, and that having the courage to face painful truths can ultimately set us free. Sarah's quick thinking and brave decision to expose her fiancé's lies not only saved her from a marriage built on deception, but also protected countless others from falling victim to the same fraud. If this story of resilience, justice, and finding true love after betrayal has resonated with you, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories, and ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest content. Have you ever had to trust your instincts in a difficult situation? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We love hearing from you and learning about your own journeys. Until next time, remember that the truth might hurt initially, but it's always the foundation for real happiness and authentic relationships.